Episode 13, The Outsider, Mercy and Judgment. Last time we focused on the parable of the lost son. We read it primarily as about sin and forgiveness. It invites the reader to adopt a God's eye and, more importantly, a God's heart view of the world. Jesus, who brings into the world a new invitation to turn back to God, shares table fellowship with sinners. This is a cause not for murmuring, but for rejoicing. So the parable can be read as a lesson for all those of Jesus' time who complained that Jesus eats with sinners. But it can also be read at another level, as a lesson for all those faithful followers of the Torah generations later who will be disturbed that non-Jews, people who have been living in a far country, are now invited to share in the Christian Eucharist and are welcomed into the house of the Father. The idea that the salvation of God extended to foreigners without the discipline of the Torah perhaps seemed disturbing to many Jews in the cosmopolitan world of the Roman Empire. There was, after all, a social cost to maintaining religious identity outside Judea, especially after the Jewish revolt. For those who had made the effort, it was difficult to say none of that mattered. However, the creation story in Genesis presents God as God of all humankind. And among the prophecies of Isaiah, we find an image of people of all nations streaming to the holy mountain of God. All the Gospels include stories of non-Jews attracted by the person of Jesus, who brings them a healing and forgiveness as well. They respond to him intuitively as an emissary of the God of the universe. Nevertheless, this runs up against a deeply rooted religious paradigm that divides the world into sinners and righteous, clean and unclean, religious insiders and religious outsiders. Luke challenges that paradigm most forcefully in a sharp encounter between Jesus and a lawyer. It turns a similar, more ironic scene from Mark on its head. The lawyer asks Jesus what he must do to receive eternal life. Jesus throws the question back at him. The lawyer quotes the Shema from Deuteronomy. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, and so on. And the commandment from Leviticus, you must love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus affirms this, the lawyer challenges Jesus with the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus responds with the parable of the Samaritan, who rescues the victim of a roadside robbery after a priest and a Levite have walked past on the other side. When Jesus asks the lawyer which one of the three proved himself a neighbor, the lawyer accepts the lesson. It was the one who performed the work of mercy. Again, we glimpse here a point being made that nothing that Jesus says or does is alien to good scriptural theology. What I want is mercy, not sacrifice, says the prophet Hosea for one, a message that will be echoed by Jeremiah. The point, of course, is that for many Judeans at the time of Jesus, Samaritans were even more untouchable than the Egyptians, Phoenicians, Syrians, Greeks, and Romans that surrounded them. Samaritans followed the Torah in their own style. They had their own sanctuary on Mount Gerizim, in the heartlands of the ancient kingdom of Israel, or as it was also called, Samaria. 4 centuries earlier, they had chosen to continue to intermarry with the local population and split away from the returned exiles, who were rebuilding their lives around Jerusalem. Local intra-religious rivalries can often be more intense than inter-religious ones. This one seems to have been no exception. In Luke's Gospel, we see a Samaritan village refusing to let Jesus and his disciples pass through because they are on their way to Jerusalem. Jesus' disciples respond in kind, suggesting they should ask God to rain fire from heaven on the village. Jesus reproaches them for this knee-jerk reaction, hinting at the wider view he takes of the Samaritan tradition that will surface in the parable a little later in the same chapter. There are different ways of reading what is going on in the parable. Some scholars have suggested that the priest and the Levite pass by because they are worried about being made impure by contact, or potentially so, with a corpse. Others suggest that this would not actually have been an issue. A priest and a Levite could perfectly well have been expected to carry out a work of mercy for an injured man. A better explanation is that Jesus is using a standard formula for anecdotes found in the rabbinic tradition. This would be a little like Catholic religious jokes that begin with a permutation of a Dominican, a Franciscan, and a Jesuit. The expected rabbinic formula would run a priest, a Levite, and an Israelite. That makes the Samaritan in the story especially disconcerting when he appears in the place of the Israelite. The point, though, is a powerful one, that being a true Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, is about fulfilling the spirit of the law, responding to its deeper meaning. Mercy, not sacrifice. Response to the fellow human being in need, not the preservation at all costs of sacred religious boundaries. In the background, there is a hint of a theme also found in John's Gospel, the idea of the true Israel. Remember those strands of protest Judaism evidenced in the texts found at Qumran, the ones that rejected the regime in Jerusalem. From the protest perspective, the Samaritans, as heirs of the ancient kingdom of Israel Samaria, who worship the Lord and have the same Torah, more or less, still potentially belong in the family. Jesus' sympathy for the Samaritans in this chapter of Luke is underlined later in the Gospel when a Samaritan leper returns to thank him for being cured. There are parallels in John's Gospel where a whole chapter is devoted to a conversation between Jesus and a Samaritan woman. And in his description of the growing church in Acts, Luke will describe groups of Samaritans becoming Christians. This perspective on the outsider in Luke mirrors his distinctive genealogy. You'll remember, as he works his way back through Jesus' ancestors, his genealogy deliberately misses out the kings of Judah and goes through to David as king of all Israel. This has a powerful symbolic value because David was king of the united kingdom of the whole people of God from before the great split between the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Samaria. The implication is that Jesus' messiahship too will reunite the whole people of God. But then from David, the genealogy goes all the way up through Abraham to Adam, the first human, the Son of God. The reunification goes deeper. Jesus will bring back together everything that has been separated. First, he will overcome divisions within the children of Abraham, but ultimately, he will overcome the divisions that separate human beings who are all made in the image and likeness of God. There is a dramatic irony present in all the Gospels, that through his contact with outsiders, public sinners, tax collectors, people possessed, foreigners, Jesus himself will become an outsider. All Gospels report the slur that he is an agent of Beelzebul. Matthew and Luke quote Jesus from the common source, reporting that people call him a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Luke and John report his opponents labeling him Samaritan. Finally, at his trial before the high priest in the 3 synoptic Gospels, he will be officially convicted of blasphemy and condemned to death. That death by crucifixion will be shameful outside the city walls. Jesus becomes an object of curse. Cursed is the man who is hanged from a tree, says the book of Deuteronomy. We'll be going back to the drama of the judgment that falls on Jesus through the religious leadership in Jerusalem in the podcast on Branch 4. Here, I just want to highlight the narrative relationship between his embrace of the outsider through his mission and the growing suspicions about his authenticity as an agent of God. Jesus becomes the religious outsider to whom he reaches out. All this gives important context to material in the Gospels that has often been read out of context over the centuries, with disastrous consequences. This material includes the theme of the judgment of God, which is embedded in Jesus' prophecy over Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. This is what we will explore in the next podcast.